Can you talk to us a little on ideas that led you writing the Orientalist despotism? Was it because of the debate in the 60s and early 70s on this topic, both in Iran and in outside of Iran?
In historiography, there was an old tradition in Europe that kings in Europe ruled through landed aristocracy. But outside Europe, and they were thinking mostly about Ottoman Empire and China, that they ruled with their servants, or basically some bureaucracy. And this was an old dispute, basically image that goes back to Machiavelli, and you see this in Hume all the way through. And it comes through in Marx and Engels too, that at one point they talk about the Asiatic mode of production being very different from the feudal European system. So in Iranian studies, this also became an issue in the early 60s. Ahmad Ashraf had written a piece about why the bourgeoisie had never succeeded in Iran, and his answer was because of the bureaucracy or the despotism of the Qajars. And my interest was to actually go back to the Qajar period and see how the Qajars actually administered their society. What was the relationship between state and society? How were they functioning? And I got especially interested because I discovered in Engels' letters that at one time he was also very interested in this issue. How much was in Iran a sort of a despotic system or something different? He actually he learned Persian to study this issue. And within 2 weeks, he was fluent actually reading Persian. And he started reading, he was being a good scholar, a historian. He was interested in primary sources to answer his question, how the Qajars basically ruled their country. After learning Persian, reading a lot of Persian, I suspect poetry, he got disillusioned. He discovered there wasn't really much he could get from that. And so being a good historian, he gave up on this project because he couldn't find the materials to answer his question. So there was a question for him, well, how did this regime basically rule its society? So I sort of picked up on that, tried to look at what materials there were to answer that question. And it became quite obvious right from the beginning that the Qajars did not have a bureaucracy. They did not have a strong state. In fact, there was no state at all. There was no bureaucracy. And the term sometimes people had used hydraulic societies, that Asian society mode of production was based on large irrigation works of dams and so on. This just didn't apply to Iran because the Qajars were not involved in such projects. And the Qanat system, in fact, was much more decentralized. It gave more power to local landlords and rather than the state. So the question became, how does one answer the image that the Qajars had despotic power and appeared to have be despotic? And most European travelers from Europe in the Qajar period, in fact, were impressed by the claims the Qajars had about ruling and being shadows of God on earth, being basically the ultimate source of authority. But they didn't have a bureaucracy and a state to run it. So my basically interest was trying to sort of solve this question. And what I came up with was that what the Qajars' basically method of rule was to manipulate a segmented society. The society was in fact very divided into very localized groups, both in terms of tribal, regional, sectarian, that therefore the society was so weak that it was able to be controlled by a state or so-called state, a monarch that didn't have bureaucratic instruments of controlling. So the Weberian notion or the Wittfogel notion of a hydraulic society, of the state controlling society, just didn't apply to Iran. But the way you could explain Qajar claims of having a despotic authority was to look at how weak society was in terms of fragmentation. This didn't mean the civil society didn't exist. In fact, the closer one looks at, you find that in 19th century Iran, there was a lot of local, so you could say, civil society, whether it's in the tribe or whether it's in the city, mahalle, the quarter, or among the local religious communities. But these communities were very much divided, local communities. They were not national communities that could act as a balance against the authority of the central king. So that became basically my interest in looking at what existed before 20th century Iran. Yeah. But I wasn't willing to, I didn't know enough about earlier periods. I wouldn't want to generalize what was going on in the Safavid or Achaemenian or the Parthian periods of Iranian history. I was just purely looking at 19th century Qajar Iran.
Can we begin thinking of this whole debate on patrimonialism or Orientalist despotism versus feudalism and so on and so forth? The lack of central bureaucracy, the weakness of central authority, as at least potentially positive. By positive, I mean in 19th century Iran, certainly in the second part of that century, we witnessed social movements, both in Tehran and in other parts of Iran. And basically at the end of the century or beginning of 20th century, we had a rather successful civic movement into changing nature of the states from what it was into a constitutionalism. Would it be wrong to begin thinking that perhaps the socio-economic political structure of Iran in 19th century in a way enabled people to rise up? There were enough spaces or multiplicity of power structures so that there was some room, there was a space for Iranians to organize, to voice their concerns, and eventually to be able to unite and basically engage in a rather successful social change project.
Yes, I mean, when I was talking about Qajar Iran, I was talking about early Qajar, basically early 19th. But what you do see happening in the 19th century is basically the impact of the West. And by impact of the West, I mean socio-economic impact of trade, Iran being incorporated into a more capitalist Western system. This then actually brings about fundamental changes into society in that local politics becomes now national politics, because localities, various cities that in the past looked at themselves basically as very regional, become much more part of a national unit. And this you can see both in terms of the threat from the West of traders, the coming of commercialization of agriculture, especially tobacco, opium, also communications with telegraph. So what you find in the late 19th century is a fragmented society becomes a much more national society. And as that happens, you have class formations. So before, I would say in the traditional system, classes were very fragmented. But because of the impact of the West, you have then created for the first time of class identity, especially in the bazaars, and also a new class that is created, the intelligentsia, a small class, but an important class. So this then brings us forward to the Mashrutiyat period. And also, of course, even with the tobacco crisis, you find for the first time basically national movements that are very different to what they had been traditionally. And there you could say the beginnings of class politics. And then that results in the Constitutional Revolution, the culmination in the Constitutional Revolution. Again, the article on the Constitutional Revolution was addressing the question, really, what caused the Constitutional Revolution? Historically, in Iran, the interpretation was because of Western ideas, that ideas of the Enlightenment, liberalism came in. This created discontent with despotism, and this culminated in the crisis between the Qajar court and the society over demand for a constitution. I wasn't negating that argument, but I was saying that there was actually something else going on, which was the economic and changes in Iran being incorporated into the Western capitalist system that was changing society, especially creating classes, and that it was that changes that brought about the Constitutional Revolution, not just the ideas of the Enlightenment. So that article was a sort of a critique or a dialogue with people like Abrahamian, who had always argued that the Constitutional Revolution was due to the Enlightened ideas coming in from the West. I was arguing that, in fact, there were socioeconomic changes that had occurred that led to the eventual Constitutional Revolution.
Well, of course, first of all, on the first issue of constitutional revolution being a sort of merely or exclusively a Western inspired movement, the constitutionalists were also inspired by what was going on in many other parts of the world, right? The Russian-Japanese War, what was happening in India, what was happening in the Ottomans, certainly what was happening in certain parts of Russia. Abrahamian sort of ignores some of this, right? But to go back to our earlier discussion, particularly first session we had, in addition to intellectuals and high-ranking officials who joined the Constitution or the constitutional movement, and then later the actual political movement that led to the revolution. Certainly in the second part of 20th century, we see Iranians in general, perhaps for the first time in cities, organizing into protest movements, right? We usually know of, or the reference usually are to the tobacco movement and the constitutional movements, but really all over in Iran, particularly in the cities, we see rebellions, we see organized protests, which on the one hand confirms your analysis that there are class formations are taking place, that people are now involving in social actions, organizing. This is not movements merely based on tribal or other kind of what is called traditional affiliation, but there is some elements of what we usually call modern societies, right? And I want to ask you a question on this. I don't see it in your piece. Well, there are three pieces: the crowd in Iranian politics, the crowd in the constitutional revolution or movement, and you have an article on the Constitution, right? Am I right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I see all the elements of what I'm about to say present there, but you don't clearly articulate that. And that is that perhaps the Qajar state, certainly Nasruddin Shah and after, but mainly really Nasruddin Shah, also facilitated or helped, or they had a vision of, if you want to call it, modern Iran, because some of this development was initiated by, certainly by the Qajar state, the long period of Nasruddin Shah. Of course, even historians sometimes acknowledge this, but by just giving credit to Farahani or Amir Kabir or others. But when one looks at this more serious way, it seems that there were new institutions, new kind of economic activities that seems to be encouraged, at least, by the Qajar space. To be a little bold on this, let me ask it this way, Ervand, and see what you think. Would it be fair to say that they had a particular vision of modernity for Iran that was probably more compatible with, say, your analysis of what the nature of 19th century Iran was?
Well, I think yours actually, the question raises the whole related issue is, you know, in Iranian historiography, there was always this underlying, were the Qajars good or bad? So I'm not interested whether judging moral assessment of whether they're good or bad. The question is what was happening and what were they doing? Clearly, the Qajars, even the early Qajars, realized they could tap into Iranian history, the way for the revival of Shahnameh, old Iranian names and so on. It's there. So you can always, if you call that modernity, which I would not, I don't like to use the word modernity, but if one uses that in that way, yes, they were modern. But I think the real issue is that any changes they tried, reforms they wrote, I wouldn't say modernity, but any attempts they tried to build a strong centralized state, a bureaucratic state, was very limited and failed, because basically they didn't have the economic resources. And the more they did, they became dependent on Western loans, and that made them even more basically dependent on the West and weaker. So whether they actually did much modernization or whatever term you want to call, was very limited. And that, in fact, created also resentment, opposition, because the main reason for much of the opposition was that they were becoming much more basically dependent on Western loans and were weak in defending the society against onslaught from the West. So I wanted to, in my articles, wanted to avoid this whole issue, whether they were good or bad. I wasn't interested in that issue. The question was why they had failed basically to create any centralized state, even by 1900. So they had some things like, you know, Dar al-Fanun. They've created a few ministries, but without actually the organization of the ministries. You had in Tehran, let's say, a minister of this or that, but in the provinces, there were really no ministry as the departments. So Iran, even at during the Mashrutiyat, still had no centralized state. So I think that becomes the real issue of the lack of a centralized, strong state, rather than the question whether the Qajars were bad or good, or a modernizer or not modernizers, corrupt or not corrupt. these questions that had dominated a lot of the polemics in Iran about the Qajars. Of course, when the Pahlavis came, there was also an onslaught on the Qajars as basically corrupt and backward and had held back Iran, and they were blamed for it. And I think that nowadays there's a reaction to that and looking at the Qajars as actually being good people, good guys who were trying to modernize but didn't succeed. And so that becomes a polemical issue about good or bad. And I was trying to avoid that whole discussion.